Hello and welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, leverage buyouts.
Jake, that's literally no one's favorite topic.
We got a ton of inquiries in our mailbag on this.
We don't even have a mailbag.
All right, well, this is my TikTok, so we're going to talk about leverage buyouts today.
This isn't going on TikTok, Jake.
In our last episode, we talked about what private equity investors look for before making an investment into a company. Today, we're going to discuss how those private equity funds actually pay for those investments. Investors have two sources of capital when buying a company: debt and equity. Debt, also referred to as leverage, is typically provided by a lender and comes at a lower cost of capital than equity. When you think about the typical interest rate charged by a lender, you're talking about a range of 5 to 8% or thereabouts, which is substantially less costly than the cost of equity, which generally is 15% or even much higher. Equity is simply the cash provided by the private equity funds, and the investors behind these funds have an expectation for a higher rate of return than those of debt providers. Buyers always seek to find the optimal mix of debt and equity to fund their purchase of a company. The lower their cost of capital, the greater their rate of return to their investors. The primary way buyers lower their cost of capital is by using as much debt as possible. This is why we refer to private equity acquisition of companies as leveraged buyouts. This isn't as complicated as it sounds. If you've ever bought a house using a home mortgage, then you have done a leveraged buyout. The 20% cash you put down is equity, and the 80% you borrow from the bank is leverage. As a home buyer, you can increase the equity value of your home by paying down your home mortgage loan or by renovating your house. The general principle here is that you are using debt capital, or leverage, as a means to invest in an appreciating asset. A leveraged buyout is essentially the same thing, but instead of buying a house, the investor is buying a company. This is a really important concept to understand, because if a private equity investor makes a decision to lever up a company by using a high ratio of debt to EBITDA, their margin for error and poor performance is very small. This is a risk versus return trade-off decision. As we discussed previously, the more debt versus equity that a private equity investor uses, the higher the rate of return for their investors. The downside is that if a company defaults on its debt due to poor performance, equity investors lose their investment in total. Private equity-backed companies generally operate with a high amount of leverage. This is especially true in the dental space. When an investor looks to use a leveraged buyout strategy in acquiring a company, they accept the risk that the company could default on its debt and completely wipe out their investment. That's why it is so important that they pick the right company to back. In our previous video, we discussed this very topic. Let's walk through a couple quick examples of a leveraged buyout. In example number 1, a private equity investor buys Company A for $100 million. Company A has $10 million of EBITDA, so the valuation is equal to 10 times EBITDA. This investor uses $40 million of equity and $60 million of debt to fund its purchase of the company. They have now used 4 turns of equity and 6 turns of debt. Therefore, the company is now 6 times levered. In example number 2, the same private equity investor buys Company B for $500 million. Company B has $50 million of EBITDA, so the valuation of this company is also equal to 10 times its EBITDA. The investor uses $200 million of equity and $300 million of debt to fund its purchase of the company. In this example, Company B is also 6 times levered. Even though Company B has way more debt than Company A, the ratio of debt to EBITDA is the same. This is ultimately what lenders and investors look to as a basic metric for the health of a company. Now, let's say Company A's EBITDA declines by 10%. Maybe they made some bad investments, some key leadership left, or some softening in the economy drove down customer demand. Now their EBITDA is $9 million, but their debt is still $60 million. So their leverage ratio is nearly 6.7 times. Unfortunately for Company A, it has a covenant in its loan agreement with the bank that its total leverage cannot exceed 6.5 times. As a result, they've defaulted on their debt, and the lender can take ownership of the company. The $40 million of equity that the investors originally invested into Company A is now worth pennies on the dollar. This is exactly what would happen if you defaulted on your home mortgage. The bank would foreclose on the home, and your equity value would go to zero. Company B is a different story altogether. The business grew organically by $3 million, and it acquired Company C for a valuation of $50 million. Company C has EBITDA of $10 million, and Company B funded its investment with $50 million of incremental debt, or leverage. Company B now has $63 million of total EBITDA and $350 million of total debt. Even though it has increased the amount of leverage that it has, it is actually healthier financially because its leverage ratio has now dropped to below 5.6 times. Now that Company B has had so much success, its shareholders are ready to sell the company or recapitalize it. They find a buyer at a valuation of $756 million, which is 12 times the company's EBITDA of $63 million. Remember that Company B has $350 million of total debt, so the resulting equity value to the investors is $406 million. This is a really solid return for its shareholders. They invested $200 million initially, and now they're getting $406 million back, which is a little over 2 times their original invested capital. This is the same concept as selling a house. The equity value of the home is equal to the sale price of the home minus the remaining mortgage. I hope this video has helped to simplify some of the concepts around leverage and leverage buyouts. Join me on our next episode where we will talk about the difference between multiples and multiples of invested capital.